Have you ever seen your phone ring? And instead of answering, you let it ring out. Heart slightly racing, mind already preparing excuses. You tell yourself, I'll call back later, but deep down, you know you probably won't. If this feels familiar, you're not alone. And more importantly, it's not laziness, rudeness, or social failure. It's psychology. People who avoid phone calls are often misunderstood. They're labeled as distant, careless, or antisocial. But the truth is far more complex and far more human. Let's break down what's really happening inside the mind of someone who avoids phone calls, and why this behavior says much more about emotional intelligence, boundaries, and mental processing than most people realize. First, phone calls demand immediate emotional presence. Unlike texts, you can't pause, edit, or regulate your response. The conversation happens now. For many people, that sudden demand feels invasive. Their brain doesn't resist connection, it resists loss of control. When someone calls, they're entering your mental space without warning. For people who are emotionally sensitive or highly self-aware, it can feel overwhelming. Many phone call avoiders are deep thinkers. Their minds don't move fast, they move deep. When asked a question, they don't want to answer quickly. They want to answer accurately. Texting allows time to process thoughts. Calls don't. So avoidance becomes a way to protect mental clarity, not to avoid the person. Another major reason is emotional regulation. Phone calls amplify emotion. Tone of voice, pauses, sighs, subtle shifts, all of it hits at once. For people who are empathetic or emotionally attuned, this can be draining. They don't just hear words. They feel emotions. After a long day, a call can feel like emotional labor rather than simple communication. This is especially true for people who grew up in environments where conversations were tense, unpredictable, or emotionally loaded. If phone calls once meant arguments, pressure, or bad news, the nervous system remembers. Even years later, the body reacts before the mind can explain why. The avoidance isn't conscious, it's protective. There's also the fear of being trapped. Texts end when you choose. Calls end when both people agree. That loss of control creates subtle anxiety. What if the call drags on? What if you don't know how to exit politely? What if the conversation turns heavy? For people who value autonomy, this uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Avoiding calls becomes a way to preserve personal freedom. Some people avoid calls because they associate them with performance. They feel pressure to sound confident, cheerful, interesting, or normal. Silence feels awkward. Pauses feel like failure. So instead of risking discomfort, they choose written communication where they can show up as their best version, not their most spontaneous one. This is common in people with social anxiety, but also in highly self-aware individuals. They're not scared of people, they're hyper-aware of themselves. Every word feels weighted. Every pause feels loud. Text removes that pressure. Another overlooked factor is cognitive overload. Modern life is noisy. Notifications, responsibilities, expectations. A phone call adds another layer of demand. People who avoid calls often already feel mentally saturated. Their avoidance isn't about the caller, it's about capacity. They simply don't have the bandwidth at that moment. Interestingly, many phone call avoiders are actually excellent communicators in writing. They express themselves clearly, thoughtfully, and deeply. They don't lack communication skills. They prefer intentional communication over impulsive interaction. Avoiding phone calls can also be a sign of strong boundaries. Some people have learned often the hard way that constant availability leads to burnout. They've chosen to control how and when others access their time and energy. In a world that rewards instant responses, this choice is often misinterpreted as coldness. In reality, it's self-respect. There's also the element of emotional safety. Texting creates distance. Distance creates safety. For people who've been misunderstood, interrupted, or invalidated in conversations before, calls feel risky. Written words feel safer because they can't be twisted mid-sentence or drowned out. Now here's the part most people don't expect. People who avoid phone calls are often more emotionally intelligent. Not less, they understand their limits. They recognize what drains them. They know when their nervous system needs calm, not stimulation. They don't confuse accessibility with intimacy. They know that constant contact doesn't equal closeness. Meaningful connection to them comes from depth, not frequency. Of course, avoidance can become unhealthy if it turns into isolation. When fear controls behavior rather than awareness, connection suffers. But for many people, avoiding phone calls isn't about fear, it's about alignment. So if you avoid phone calls, ask yourself this: do you feel anxious or do you feel relieved? If it's relief, your mind might be protecting your peace. If it's anxiety, there may be unresolved experiences asking for tension. And if you're someone who feels rejected when others don't answer calls, remember this: their silence isn't personal, it's neurological, it's emotional, it's human. In the end, how someone prefers to communicate says nothing about how much they care, everything about how their mind works. Understanding that changes everything. If this felt uncomfortably accurate, you already know why you clicked.